All right. Thank you very much for attending session 6A, Data Repositories of the RDAP Summit 2023. This is a Zoom webinar. Attendees are muted and your cameras are turned off. To ask a question, please use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. This session will run from 12:45 to 1:45 Eastern, with the last 15 minutes for a Q&A. The session will include 2 live presentations followed by 2 pre-recorded lightning talks. You will be able to ask questions of presenters from both live and recorded talks at the end. Please indicate the presenter or presenters you would like to direct your question to. We'll save all questions again until the end of the session. After the session, you can still continue the talk in the chat in Whova if you wish. The Research Data Access and Preservation Summit organizers are committed to providing an environment where all attendees can participate fully in the program and activities without fear of harassment or discriminatory behavior of any kind. There is a code of conduct helper available during this session. Their name is Emily. You may direct messages to them in Whova if you need assistance. They can give you the code of conduct, email address, or the link to the incident report form if needed. So our first presentation today is going to be Ted Haberman. Our first presenter is going to be Ted Haberman from Metadata Game Changers. And his talk is called Connecting Repositories to the Global Research Community, a Recuration Process. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you, Linda. See if we can get this to go. Looks good. Does it look good there?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm Ted Haberman from Metadata Game Changers, and as Linda just mentioned, I changed the order of the clauses in my title because I wanted to talk a little bit about recuration. Of course, many people in RDAP are super familiar and experts at curating data sets as they come into repositories, and that's a super important process that improves metadata, improves accessibility, improves possibility. But the landscape, the metadata landscape for describing data sets is changing a lot around the world, and things are now available that were not available in the past in metadata standards and metadata capabilities. And so getting those new capabilities into data sets that have already been curated on the way into the repository is something that I call recuration, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. A lot of people have a hard time understanding sort of what metadata is, or I'm of course been working on metadata for a long time, but I wanted to use an example that's sort of maybe closer to home, having to do with going to the grocery store and selecting things that you want to eat. So these 2 cans represent 2 undocumented data sets that are coming into a repository or being submitted to a repository. And in a lot of cases, repositories create minimum metadata. One of the sentences that we hear a lot is, what is the minimum metadata? And that's sort of the end of the metadata discussion. In many repositories that do curation, it's not, but there are others. So minimum metadata separates these 2 cans into 2 categories of dog food and soup. And that supports discovery. So if we're looking for soup, we can grab that can. But the recuration process adds metadata to above the minimum, above and beyond the minimum, and it identifies the data sets more completely. It connects those data sets to, in this case, companies that created them. These 2 cans actually have URLs on them that you can look at. They have ingredients. They have identifiers you can see on the dog food, sort of the identifier on it. So this is sort of the difference between minimum metadata that you might have in a data set and metadata that's recurated and augmented. So this is an example that I found helpful in explaining to people what metadata are. And I wanted to talk today about 2 two kinds of repositories, and the work that I'm going to describe was funded by two projects from the National Science Foundation, both early research projects, eagers. One was Dryad Bridge, building repository interconnections with Dryad guidance and extensions, and Dryad, as many of you know, is a generalist repository. The second one was completing the life cycle, developing evidence-based models of research data sharing. This was a project done by the DCN or DCN members. And so in that case, we were dealing with institutional repositories from research universities. And I know that many attendees at RDAP work in that kind of repository. So the recuration process in this case is adding identifiers and making connections. And Dryad, for instance, and these institutional repositories have existed for many years, over a decade in the case of Dryad. So when Dryad started, there weren't any identifiers really. So many data sets have been added into Dryad, and they didn't have identifiers. So recuration is required to add those and to allow making the connections in the global research infrastructure. So the Dryad case, we started like this. And the Dryad original model was the metadata was very minimal. In fact, in 2008, when they started, the instructions were, please email your data to this email address and include a reference to a publication. So very, very thin metadata in the beginning of Dryad. And but that connection to the publication was very important. And Dryad was built with the idea of publishing or curating and preserving data sets associated with papers. Many of those papers, and fortunately in Dryad, we had the DOIs of those papers, so we could use those DOIs to go to Crossref and retrieve affiliation information. Crossref is a great source of affiliation information for papers, for authors of papers. So we could pull those affiliations back from Dryad, which is the first step in the process. And the second step is taking those affiliations and going to ROR. ROR, when we were doing this, was just emerging repository for organizational identifiers. And we could bring those RORs back from ROR and add them into Dryad. And then we could Dryad uses DataCite as an underlying repository, so we could give the affiliations and the RORs into DataCite, and now add the organizations into this growing sort of graph of information. And of course, many of you know that Crossref has funder information, not as much funder information as affiliation information, but we could do the same process, take those DOIs to Crossref, find funder information, and add that into DataCite as well. And now we've added funders into the picture. So this is sort of a classic recuration case. We started out with discovery metadata. We added in affiliations, identifiers for organizations, and identifiers for funders and awards. And now we have a much richer connected picture. Of course, these pictures are sort of in the background, and we know that they exist, but how do we see them? So this is the DataCite Commons, and DataCite Commons is an effort by DataCite, Crossref, and ROR, and ORCID to try and start building this PID graph and the connections. So if you look at that, it allows you to search for works or people or organizations or repositories. So when we look at the University of Colorado in Boulder, which has a ROR here, we get over 1,900 works, and many of these works come from Dryad. So the fact that this paper or this data set shows up here is because we added the ROR for the University of Colorado Boulder to this DataCite metadata. Of course, funders are also interested in finding things that they funded. In this case, searching for the National Science Foundation, which also has a ROR. Again, we see these papers or data sets in this case from Dryad that are identified because of the funder information that we inserted. So the important part of this is that the Dryad added connections to the global research infrastructure for thousands of organizations, researchers also, and funders that put their data set into Dryad. And this is an important part of these recuration efforts. They benefit all of your users, all of the organizations that are using your repository, the funders that are funding that work, and the researchers that are doing it. So the second case, RADs, is institutional repositories. And I don't need to tell this group, institutional repositories play an incredibly important role in working directly with researchers, creating rich metadata with identifiers and other items that support reuse. And many of these repositories, we found that many of these repositories give minimum metadata, which is just five or six items, to DataCite in order to get a DOI back. We found at the same time that researchers who were putting data sets into into DataCite through other paths like Zenodo or various other sort of generalist repositories had much richer metadata. So they were taking advantage of what they were learning from the repositories, from the institutional repositories, and providing more rich metadata to DataCite. So, and of course, many of these things emphasize the A, I, and R in FAIR, whereas the minimum metadata at DataCite's really just F. So what we explored there was improved tools and recreation of those data, and the recreation of the metadata in DataCite, taking advantage of the rich metadata that was in the institutional repository. So one of the things that we want that's important in these situations is trying to make the invisible visible, to measure the completeness of the metadata. So this is a visualization of some fairness evaluations, and these are metadata elements divided into 4 different categories, and measuring the completeness of those metadata elements to these categories. And of course, this is DataCite metadata. And as I mentioned, most DataCite metadata has just the minimums in the upper left-hand corner, but it has capabilities for adding these. So there's 5 different numbers here of percentages of completeness, and we can make a summary for this by just plotting these 5 numbers as one line. And so this line sort of gives us an idea of what the completeness is in these 4 different categories and overall, and allows us to compare different repositories or different metadata and find differences. In this case, we can compare 2 different sets of metadata before the recuration. This is what it looks like in this case. And this is averaged over 6 different institutional repositories. We can then use those tools that I mentioned to improve the completeness. And we can show the difference between the yellowish line and the red line is the increase in the fairness of the metadata in these repositories that was enabled or facilitated by these new tools. And what's important here is this is existing metadata content. And in the institutional repository case, that rich metadata is created by the partnership between the institutional repository and the researchers in the institution is really a gold mine of high quality metadata, particularly for supporting things in the A, I, and R, or putting the air in FAIR. So here we used existing content and migrated it into the global repository, the global infrastructure. So 2 examples here. The first was Dryad. In the Dryad case, we really had a 2-way identifier flow where we were using elements of the the global infrastructure to get identifiers out, and then we were putting them back in to a different part of the global infrastructure, pulling them out from Crossref in this case, and adding them in directly into DataCite to make that metadata richer. in the institutional repository case, it was a different picture. We had rich metadata in the institutional repositories, and we migrated that into the global infrastructure to make it better. As all of us are using the global infrastructure, remember, what you put in is what you get out. So adding richer metadata into that global infrastructure as soon as possible is an important aspect. This is that's the end of the presentation. I guess we'll have questions later, but there are a few links to a few blogs here that discuss some of this work in more detail. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ted. And feel free, yes, please there's going to be questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end. Thank you, Ali, for doing that. Awesome. Okay, so moving to our next presentation, we have For the Community, by the Community, developing a survey of Canadian Dataverse administrators. And this is, the presenters are Megan Goodchild of Queen's University and Scholars Portal, Elisa Rod of McGill University, and Tara Stieglitz from McEwen University. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction. We're really pleased to be here today to discuss a community-led initiative to design and implement a survey of Canadian Dataverse administrators. So we're really pleased to be here today. To begin, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands on which we work and live. So I'm coming from Queen's University, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, and we're grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands.
And I'm coming from McGill University, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka.
And McEwen University is located in Amiskwaciy-Waskahegan, also known as Edmonton, in Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous peoples.
So we recognize it's important to acknowledge the land we occupy, but it's only a first step. And we are settlers and allies in reconciliation, so we're committed to reflecting on our actions. And in this project, our aim is really to develop a better understanding of the needs of our national community, including efforts to support Indigenous data sovereignty as well. So for our agenda today, we'll begin with a brief history of Dataverse in Canada. Next, we'll describe how we established a Canadian Dataverse admin survey working group and the process of survey development. And finally, we'll conclude with some lessons learned and next steps as well. So to begin, just a brief summary of what Dataverse is. I'm sure many of you know. Dataverse is an open source repository software that allows users to deposit, publish, share, and discover research data. Currently, there are 96 installations around the world and a global community of contributors to the software development as well. The software, it's a generalist repository software, but it supports multidisciplinary research data sets and also the FAIR principles to make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Academic libraries have increasingly recognized the need to support research data management activities, and specifically to establish and support research data repositories for data deposit, sharing, and discovery. In the early 2010s, institutions across Canada began hosting local installations of the Dataverse software. So this map represents the landscape of Dataverse installations around the mid-2010s, including, you'll see there, the University of British Columbia, the University of Alberta, and also Scholars Portal Dataverse, which was a shared service of the Ontario Council of University Libraries, and that represented actually 21 institutions in Ontario. Academic libraries were directly involved with providing support and managing the deposit workflow, including data curation activities. And as a result, there was a recognized need to share knowledge and expertise as part of this process, which led to the formation of Dataverse North. This is a community of practice for libraries who are using Dataverse or interested in using Dataverse in Canada. And then in response to recommendations from that Dataverse North community and increasing interest as well, a national shared Dataverse service was launched in 2020. And this is hosted at Scholars Portal and the University of Toronto libraries, and also in partnership with the 4 academic regional library consortia across Canada. with support of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, which is a national network supporting digital research infrastructure. And in 2022, we launched the new name and branding for that service. So it's now called Borealis, the Canadian Dataverse Repository. The service continues to grow, and we have over 65 subscribing institutions now to the service. And each institution manages their own collection and can build services to support data deposit and sharing with their local researchers. So alongside the growth of this sort of national service and infrastructure, the community supporting Dataverse in Canada has also been growing and evolving. So as part of this Alliance Network of Experts, Dataverse North coordinates working groups that work collaboratively. They do things like develop shared resources, for example, training resources and policy documentation and things like that. And recently a new working group was formed, the new Borealis Community Facilitation Team. This is a group that supports the growing community of Dataverse administrators that use the Borealis service. It includes representation from the Borealis team itself and also Dataverse North. And this team coordinates monthly meetings and also manages a listserv for knowledge exchange. This community of Canadian Dataverse administrators continues to grow. There are over 120 members on the listserv and a large group that are attending these monthly meetings. And given the rapid growth of this community, there was a strong need to better understand this group and the challenges that they face. So as a community-led initiative, a working group was formed under Dataverse North to develop a national survey with the goal to answer these kinds of questions. So now I'll turn it over to Tara to describe how we formed this working group and also the goals of the survey as well.
So our first step was to establish a working group. So a call went out to the listserv to recruit members. And we ended up with people from institutions across Canada. So the group represented a range of institution types from large research-intensive universities to smaller, more teaching-focused institutions. And most of them are English language institutions, but we do have one representative from a Francophone university. And we have other members of the working group that do speak French. The main goals of our survey were first to develop an understanding of who Canadian Dataverse administrators are. We know that it's a diverse group with diverse needs, and we hope to get a better understanding of those needs. We want to know what they do, how they use Dataverse, and the nature of the services that they support, the challenges they face, and their perceptions of the emerging national community of Dataverse administrators in Canada. We also hope to collect information to help the Dataverse North Expert Group and the Borealis Dataverse Community Facilitation Team design programs and plan initiatives to support Dataverse administrators in their work. So this is a timeline of what we've been doing and what we plan to do in the near future. So we started last summer by establishing the working group and beginning the planning process. And in the fall, we conducted background research and developed questions and validated those questions. In the winter, we got ethics approval, which of course took longer than we anticipated, and got the survey translated so that we have versions in both French and English. The first survey will be administered very soon, so probably before the end of the winter semester. And then the second survey will be administered in the spring. And then we will be conducting analysis of those results. Into the summer, we plan additional dissemination activities, including an academic publication and other conference presentations. The results will also be shared with the Dataverse admin community, and they will be used to plan initiatives for Dataverse admins. I'll now pass this along to my colleague to discuss survey development.
Great, thank you. So first, when we set out to develop the survey, we ended up reviewing related surveys as a group and did a lot of collaborative brainstorming. So we ended up coming up with a set of questions that we adapted from existing surveys about data repository infrastructure that had been fielded in other contexts. And we also came up with new questions that were specific to the Canadian context. We ended up deciding to do 2 surveys, so one at the institutional level, so 1 response per institution, and then also at the individual level, because there are some institutions that have multiple Dataverse administrators. We also divided into subgroups of 2 to 3 people to work on different kinds of aspects of the survey in tandem, and that made it go more efficiently and faster. In the end, we ended up coming up with about 5 categories of topics of questions. So questions about how an institution administers their collection. So which departments or units are responsible, what's their support capacity, what challenges do they experience. We also asked about Dataverse collection policies and procedures. So the status of public or internal policies and the types and levels of curation services at different institutions. We're also interested in understanding how Dataverse administrators and institutions feel about the features of the software itself, so how useful they are and what enhancements might be needed. And then we also wanted to situate this within the broader RDM service at each institution. So what types of services are available and understanding who are the eligible users at each institution. And finally, we're interested in the perceptions about the national community and the experiences that individual Dataverse administrators have at monthly community meetings and whether they need additional support. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the qualitative pretesting that we did to validate the survey questions that we had developed ourselves. Basically, we used a method called cognitive interviews, which is a think aloud qualitative approach to identifying problematic or confusing wording of survey questions. We developed a script, so we identified questions that we were less sure about in terms of how they would be interpreted, and we recruited 4 participants who each did a 30-minute interview. The script included prompts like how easy or hard was it to choose your answer, and then we revised questions if needed based on this feedback. And I'll just give an example of what this looks like. So we had originally a question, do you have any other feedback about permissions, functionality, technical, or workflow related? We got this response from a participant, where is the question about permissions? You should have designated questions about permissions because this question came out of left field and the wording is also weird. So people didn't hold back. And also we realized that we had designed a question that came before this one that we thought was about permissions and we thought was clearly about permissions related to the installation or the instance of Dataverse. And the participants didn't see that at all. So they just felt like we were randomly asking about it. The issue was this term other in the question. So if we had any other feedback, whereas they didn't think we had already asked them about feedback. So we ended up revising that question. Do you have any feedback about your experiences with permissions? And then we explain that a bit in more detail, e.g. technical functionality or related to your workflows as an administrator. So some lessons learned about the survey development. It's challenging to design questions that will be understandable by all community members. So questions about technical infrastructure require additional context, even for experts. We found that we had to do a lot of defining and explaining for a lot of the terms we were using. There's also a lot of nuance and institutional variation in RDM service provision, which is really difficult to capture via quantitative questions. So we have to think about that a bit more. And we can't ask everything. So we need to be really strategic about what results would be actionable. So for example, right now our institutional survey has about 53 questions and takes between 30 and 60 minutes. And we felt like that was the absolute limit of what we could ask from people. But there was a ton of questions that we cut that would have been really interesting to know about as well. And then we also have a set of lessons learned that we wanted to talk about involved with the collaboration of this working group. So the collaboration between the infrastructure provider and community groups is essential to cultivate a sustainable national community. The infrastructure provider in this case, so Dataverse North, could have developed and launched the survey on their own, but this project is unique in that it was co-created by community members for community members, which allows for the project to adapt to diverse community needs. Another lesson learned, which I think a lot of folks in this session might be familiar with, is that the ethics process takes a long time, even for a really low risk study. And that if you're in a context where you're required to do bilingual work or where that's the appropriate method to pursue, that requires a lot of support and group members who are able to provide that support and additional considerations. And now I will turn it over back to Megan to just talk about how we're going to move forward.
Great, thank you so much. So in terms of next steps, we're really excited to be collecting and analyzing the results over the next few months. We're also planning on several different academic outputs, including sharing the data set itself. We're also planning community engagement events so the entire community can benefit from this research. The results will also be channeled into community initiatives that Dataverse North can lead, and also software developments that the Borealis team can lead if we find that in the results. We'd also like to administer the study on an ongoing basis so we can track responses and adapt to the changes in the needs of the administrators and the researchers that they support as well. We'd like to acknowledge our fabulous working group members who couldn't present with us today, but who have contributed so much time and effort in this process. We'd also like to thank the Alliance for translation support of all survey materials, and a special thank you to the community members who volunteered to participate in the validation testing. We're really looking forward to your questions and comments at the Q&A session, and our contact emails are there as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a really interesting project. Yeah, all looking forward to the more results. All right, well, we'll move on to our 2 lightning talks. We're going to play these back to back. So our first lightning talk will be is entitled "The SSA Dataverse, Data Repository for the Archives Profession." The presenter is Jane Fiegel from Tulane University. And her collaborators are Emily Lapworth from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Maggie Hughes at the Huntington Library, and Ashley Thomas at Harvard Medical School. And then the second lightning talk is called READMEs, Review and Researchers. Depositors to 6 academic data repositories tell us what they value most. And the presenter is Sarah Wright from Cornell. So we will go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Fiegel. I'm the metadata librarian at Tulane University, and I'm also a member of the Society of American Archivists Committee on Research, Data, and Assessment. This committee is responsible for the stewardship of the SAA Dataverse, a data repository for the archives profession, and it's what I'll be talking about today. And I'm very excited to share with you what I, Emily Lapworth, Maggie Hughes, Ashley Thomas, and our other committee members have been working on with this repository. So I'll start off today by giving some context and background info for the SAA Dataverse and how it came into existence. So in 2019, the Society of American Archivists established the Committee on Research, Data, and Assessment. And as part of their larger strategic plan to foster and disseminate research in and about the field, the committee was charged with developing a repository for data and other research outputs. The Dataverse software was selected as the repository platform. And in 2021, the Society of American Archivists officially launched the SAA Dataverse through the Odom Institute for Research in Social Science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And what exactly is the SAA Dataverse? Broadly speaking, it's an open source repository focused on sharing and preserving data related to archives in the archival profession. It supports the reuse of data sets for the purposes of fostering knowledge, insights, and a deeper understanding of archival organizations, the status of archivists, and the impact of archives and archival work on the broader society. And anyone can use and explore the SAA Dataverse. It was established to support the needs and interests of both SAA members and the broader archives community. So SAA membership is not required to download, reuse, or contribute data. And what can you find within the SAA Dataverse? This is a repository that focuses on collecting data, either qualitative or quantitative, that has value to 4 broad groups. The archives and records professions in North America, the Society of American Archivists, archival repositories, or professional archivists and archival scholars. And the background image on this slide actually shows 3 of our 4 available data sets. And if you were to explore one of them, such as the Collection Management Tools Documentation Portal Survey, you would be provided with a variety of info, such as a description of the research itself, any subjects or keywords, citation info with a DOI, and additional metadata such as the date of collection for the data, what kind of data is within the data set, and what kind of software was used to generate the data set. In addition to this, you'll find associated documentation or files such as data dictionaries, README files, or a tabular data. And if you think that you have research that could be a good fit for this repository, we encourage you to reach out and send in a submission through the SAA Dataverse's online portal. Some of the major requirements that we have for our depositors are to provide information on the origins of the data set, any methodologies used for gathering, preparing, and interpreting the data, as well as any reports derived from the data, whether they're published or unpublished. In addition, you'll also need to include associated documentation that's needed to contextualize, understand, and use the data, such as README files, images, codebooks, spreadsheets, or other tabular data. All personally identifiable information must be removed prior to submission, and you'll need to have ensured that this data is able to be shared and reused. All of our policies will be found under the SAA Dataverse Policies and Procedures dataset. There are 7 documents in total, but we do have a video tutorial series on YouTube that will walk you through the submission process. And if you have any further questions or you're interested in submitting data, please feel free to contact the Committee on Research, Data, and Assessment at corda@archivist.org, or you can get in touch with any of the members of the team that works directly with the SAA Dataverse. And if you're interested in learning more, you can scan this QR code here on the slide or go to bit.ly/CORDA2023 RDAP. And that will take you to a Google Doc that has various links and resources related to the SAA Dataverse and Corda, as well as links for all of the links in this presentation today. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sarah Wright, and I'm the Research Data and Life Sciences Librarian at Cornell University. And today I want to share what researchers told us about curation services at 6 institutions. So this is a project of the Data Curation Network, which takes a collaborative approach to data curation. We share curation expertise across a network of partner institutions and data repositories. The institutions shown on this slide are the 6 institutions that participated in this project to evaluate satisfaction level with our data curation services. However, there are more in the Data Curation Network. In late spring of 2021, we distributed an 11-question survey to everyone who had deposited data with our respective repositories over the past year, not just to those that used Data Curation Network curation services. So that ended up being 568 researchers, and we got an overall response rate of 42%. The main purpose of the survey was to assess satisfaction with our curation services, and happily, 98% of researchers agreed they were satisfied with the curatorial review. Over 90% agreed that the curation process helped them feel more confident sharing their data. And over 95% agreed that data curation added value to the data sharing process. These are great statistics to have, but I want to dig into today is the free text responses that we got, where researchers were able to tell us in their own words what was most valuable to them when depositing data and working with curators. This question was answered by 179 participants and provided a lot of qualitative data. Catching mistakes, accessibility, increased impact, and expertise or knowledge of best practices were just some of the things mentioned, as well as some who just praised the benefits of curator review in general. How to analyze this treasure trove of information? We performed qualitative coding of the free text responses. A team of 3 reviewed all of the responses and characterized them into specific themes and subthemes. So these are the free text responses coded for curation actions. Some responses mention more than one curation action, so these numbers don't add up to the total of 179. The actions most frequently mentioned were creation and enhancement of documentation and metadata. As you might imagine, it wasn't always clear whether they were referencing structured metadata or general documentation and description, for example, the addition of a README file. They also mentioned providing file or data level checks, optimizing organization or formats, identifying errors, or reviewing code. Actions that are more specific in their focus and don't apply to all data sets, like checking for personally identifiable information or intellectual property concerns, were also mentioned by a few participants. These are the free text responses coded for outcomes of curation. So they overwhelmingly reported that their data was made more understandable to others due to the work of data curators. For example, having someone outside the project or discipline point out jargon or other barriers to accessing, understanding, or using their data sets was frequently mentioned. And the last question of the survey asked participants if there was anything else they would like to tell us about their data sharing experience. Again, almost half of participants provided free text responses, expressing satisfaction with the curation service, emphasizing the value added to the data sharing process, the benefit of catching mistakes, or making suggestions to improve local workflows. We chose not to perform additional analysis on these responses because we received such a broad variety of free text, but there is a lot of valuable information still here. So there were so many gems in the responses. I always want to share more. And we often don't hear how valuable our work is. And if you're looking for evidence of the impact and value of curation in researchers' own words, in addition to numbers and statistics, this is a valuable data set to explore. So if you want to read more of the responses, the data set is in the University of Minnesota's repository, cited here. You can use the data, look at the data, adapt the survey for your own repository, and please watch for the paper that we're in the final stages of submitting for publication. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and please don't hesitate to reach out with questions and comments.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. This is a really cool project. I was excited to see all of these when I was reading through the abstracts, and I look forward to hearing more about all of this as we go forward in the next few years. Hopefully next RDAP we'll have more information about all of it. Can definitely want to thank all of our presenters and our audience for participating in the session. And we're going to see you at the next session, which I believe is our keynote at 2 p.m. And we'll have a short break at 1:40, starting now until 2 p.m. Tess, will there be a new link for the next session? I believe there will be a new link for the next session.
Yes, it will
Okay.
be a new link. So please
Okay.
refer to Whova to get to the next session.
Awesome. And if you would like to continue talking to our presenters, please feel free to use the Whova chat. And I'm sure they will be happy to answer any more questions that come up. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.